Welcome to King on Kings, a show where I interview some of the more well-known kings of Israel and Judah. Today we have a very special king, King Jehu. Do you prefer Jehu or Jehu?
Do not call me Jehu.
All right then, Jehu it is. You were known as a get-it-done kind of guy.
God sent his prophet. Told me that he wanted some people taken out. So, I took him out.
Took him out?
Took him out.
Ah yes, I do have a list here of quite a few folks that you took out. Let's see here. King Joram of Israel.
That's right.
King Ahaziah of Judah.
Killed him dead.
Queen Jezebel.
That witch didn't even see me coming.
Can't be right. It says here you killed the 70 sons of King Ahab.
Yep. And guess what?
What?
That night, slept like a baby.
And if that wasn't enough, you killed the 42 survivors of King Ahaziah's family.
42. It's my lucky number.
And on top of this, you drew all the surviving Baal worshippers and priests together under false pretenses and killed them.
Just like shooting fish in a barrel.
And yet, after getting rid of all the Baal worshippers, you both worshipped God and the golden calf, which you knew God detested, didn't you? Didn't you?
This interview is over. Hope you have a safe trip tonight.
This has been King on Kings. Next week, our guest will be Hezekiah.
Voice just a little bit today, so we'll see how this is for second service. Glad you came to first service. Second service is going to be like, and then the Lord said. Anyway, so glad that you guys are here today. We are going through a very interesting series called We Four Kings. And in this series, we are contrasting something very unique. We are contrasting the kings or the kingdoms before Christ. So before Jesus, there were these kings, and if you go into the Bible, you'll see these really cool books. They're very cleverly named, very complicated. They're called First and Second Kings, right? The Bible's too hard. I don't understand it. It's so simple, okay? So First and Second Kings are the stories of these kings that led God's people before Jesus. And Jesus was ultimately the final king of the nation of Israel and of the whole world and of God's people. And what we're doing is we're contrasting the kingdom of Jesus, or Jesus as king, and we're contrasting that with Jehu. Today, Jehu is a king in the Bible who is very unique. He lived about 700 years before Jesus. And Jehu was very unique, but he had something in common with Jesus and Jesus' kingship. It's a very interesting thing that he had in common. Thank you. That's a good idea. The common thing that he had in common was that Jehu was an angry king. Pause. Off to a rolling start today. So, Jehu was an angry king. Now listen, this is the point. Catch this today. And Jesus is an angry king. Now you might be sitting out there going, what do you mean Jesus is an angry king? Every picture I've ever seen of Jesus, Jesus is like surrounded by a bunch of little kids, or he's petting a sheep, or he's healing somebody. What do you mean that Jesus is an angry king? Well, let me give you a new picture. For many of you, this might be a new picture of who Jesus is. Jesus is the guy with kids surrounding him. Jesus is the guy holding that sheep. Jesus is the guy that heals people. But Revelation 19 gives us a whole new picture of who Jesus is. I want to read this to you. And what I want you to do is I want you to visualize it. I want you to picture this Jesus. And I don't want you to get rid of Jesus surrounded by the kids or healing people. But I want to add this picture to your images of who Jesus actually is. In Revelation 19, it is a picture of Jesus that we don't normally see. It is a a dramatization, a trajectory of who God is. Just check out this picture. Revelation 19. I saw heaven standing open, and there before me was a white horse, whose rider is called Faithful and True. With justice he judges and wages war. His eyes are like blazing fire, and on his head are many crowns. He has a name written on him that no one knows but he himself. He is dressed in a robe dipped in blood, and his name is the Word of God. The armies of heaven were following him, riding on white horses and dressed in fine linen, white and clean. Coming out of his mouth is a sharp, double-edged sword with which to strike down the nations. He will rule them with an iron scepter. And listen to this. This is Jesus. He treads the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God Almighty. And on his robe and on his thigh is written this name: King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Jesus is an angry king. Now, if this is your first Sunday, you might be sitting out there going, oh, you're one of those churches, right? You're just church that are like, oh, the intimidation. And sometimes, like, God's anger, God's wrath is used as intimidation or manipulation. I don't want to do that at all. You might be sitting there going, man, this is just like the church I grew up in. This is just like what I learned in catechism. This is what that crazy nun was always telling me. She beat me over the head with a ruler, right? No. I want to take this from a different perspective. I want you to look at this, and by the end of the day, if I can do my job, at the end of the day, what I want you to do is I want you to look at God's anger, Jesus' anger as a king, and go, it's good. Jesus' anger is good, because here's what we think. This is just what we're used to. We normally think of, like, anger as a bad thing. We normally think of, like, well, yeah, God's all good and loving and forgiving, and then every once in a while he does something that's really horrible in the Bible, and we're like, and in our heads, just because this has been our experience, we go, yeah, that was bad, and we kind of wish he wouldn't have done that. And we don't try to talk about that very much, and we pretend like it's a bad thing. But Jesus is good. God is good in every way all the time. And God's anger is good. And we, as followers of Christ, ought to be able to look at God's anger and go, yep, that's good. So here's what I want to do. I want to give you a picture of that by, again, contrasting one of the kings that preceded Jesus. The king I want to talk about is Jehu. Jehu is a very, very interesting king. I love him. And if you would have saw the video, it would have been really funny. But anyway, but Jehu was this king. And at the time of Jehu, there was this king that had just preceded Jehu, this king of Israel, God's people, who was just as bad as they could possibly be. His name was King Ahab. And what was worst about King Ahab, yeah, he was a completely self-centered person, but what was really bad about Ahab, there's a lot of names that are going to be going on. What was really bad about Ahab was his wife, right? His wife. This is one of the only kings where his wife was actually worse than he was. His wife, some of you know what I'm talking about. His wife was Jezebel, right? Pretty common name. We all know Jezebel. Ahab and Jezebel together completely destroyed the nation of Israel. Because Ahab, as his father and as his grandfather had done as kings, they placed this wedge between God and his people. And the more they led, they pushed people farther and farther away from God. And the farther they got away from God, the farther they got away from what was good. And God knew that this was a problem, because Ahab and Jezebel, together with all these other members of Ahab's family, had established Baal worship. And the people were worshiping Baal instead of God. Now, here's what's so enticing and so attractive about Baal worship. Baal worship was just created by the people for the people, okay? It was a religion, it was a god that people had made up to give them a sense of religion to give them a sense of believing in God, but at the same time, it was also very good for them. For instance, it was good to be a priest, or at least by depraved humanity, it was good to be a priest of Baal, because the Baal priests would actually ask for a farmer's daughter, a virgin farmer's daughter, to be brought to the temple so she could be sexually molested so that he would have good crops. And so the farmer would agree to it. That's just kind of a little taste of Baal worship. And Ahab and Jezebel and their family had drawn this wedge in between God and said, no, we don't serve God. We serve this Baal. And this Baal's good because he doesn't have rules and it works out good for us. And the Baal priests were like, yay, that sounds good to us. And so that was Baal worship. So in the time of Jehu, there's this prophet by the name of Elijah. You probably heard Elijah. Elijah had been running from Ahab and been running from Jezebel, and he'd spent his whole life running, and to the point where Elijah thought he was the only prophet left. And there's this cool scene, maybe some of you have heard of, where Ahab's like, I can't get these names right. Elijah is running from Ahab and Jezebel, and he's just wore out, and he thinks he's the only one left. And God comes down. You might know this story. He comes in this violent wind that splits the rocks, but there's no message. And he comes in this violent fire, and it comes down from heaven, and God isn't in the fire. And he comes in an earthquake, and there's this violent earthquake, but Elijah doesn't hear anything from God. And then God comes in a still, small voice, and he speaks to Elijah. And he tells Elijah a couple of things, but one of the things he told him is, he was like, hey, I want you to go appoint Jehu as the new king of Israel. That's the message in that still small voice. I want you to go appoint Jehu as king of Israel, and Jehu is going to carry out my work. So Elijah goes back, and eventually down the road it becomes time to appoint Jehu as king of Israel. Ahab is now dead, but God still knows there's a problem, right? Because one thing we learned from North Korea, right? Kim Jong-il, he's crazy. He gets out, and all of a sudden his son, Kim Jong-un, comes in. You got just as much crazy, if not more. And that's exactly what God knew was going to happen. Yeah, Ahab's dead, but Ahab has this huge family. In fact, Ahab had 70 sons. And you might be thinking, well, what did you do your entire life besides make babies, right? He had 70 sons that were just as evil and just as corrupt as he was. And on top of that, Jezebel was still alive. And so God appointed Jehu for a very specific task. I love how it happened. Elijah comes to one of the prophets, and he says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to run up to Jehu. At this point, Jehu is a commander of God's armies. And he says, I want you to run up to Jehu at full speed. I want you to pull him aside. I want you to pour oil on his head. I want you to anoint him as king. And then I need you to hightail it out of there. Because if anybody knew what you said to him, if anybody knew that you were appointing him as king and the task that you were giving him, they would hunt you down. So you got to run up to him, you got to tell him, and then you got to hightail it out of there. So that's exactly what this prophet does. Elijah says, okay, go. So this prophet runs up to Jehu, and Jehu's sitting around with some of his army commanders playing cards, and this guy runs up to him full speed, and he's like, can I talk to you for a second? And Jehu has no idea. He's not in line to be king. He has no idea what's going on. And Jehu looks at him, and he's like, okay. So he goes in a private room with him, and this prophet says this to him. Jehu got up and went into the house. Then the prophet poured the oil on Jehu's head and declared, and again, you got to understand, Jehu did not see this coming, poured oil on his head and said, this is what the Lord declares. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anoint you king over the Lord's people, Israel. You, and this was his task. It wasn't just that he's king, go do whatever you want. It was for a specific task. He says, you are now king. You are to destroy the house of Ahab, your master. And I will avenge the blood of my servants, the prophets, and the blood of all the Lord's servants shed by Jezebel. The whole house of Ahab will perish. I will cut off from Ahab every last male in Israel, slave or free. I will make the house of Ahab like the house of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha, son of Ahijah. As for Jezebel, dogs, catch this is God. As for Jezebel, dogs will devour her on the plot of ground at Jezreel, and no one will bury her. Then he opened up the door, and he ran away. Love that. This is stuff that would be great in a movie, right? So he runs out, he's like, I gotta tell you, okay, you're king, and you're supposed to kill all Ahab's family, you're supposed to destroy Jezebel, and dogs are going to eat her flesh. Okay, fine. And he runs away. Now, here's what's interesting. You get to know a lot about Jehu in this kind of moment. A lot of times when God's servants are prophesied to or God gives them a command, they're a little timid, right? They're not quite sure, like, how to get started or where they start or how they're going to do it, and sometimes they kind of doubt that they're capable of doing it. Not Jehu. Jehu hooks up a chariot and immediately jumps in the chariot and starts driving like a madman, okay? And it actually says that in Scripture, that he drove like a madman. And he's whipping his chariot and he's flying along, and the first stop that he makes is Joram, who is now the king of Israel. Joram is the son of Ahab, and Ahaziah married into Ahab's family, and he's the king of Judah, all God's people. His first stop is to go right for Joram. So he goes straight for Joram. He's driving down the road, and he's whipping his chariot. And Joram looks at him, and he's not really sure what to think. Like, okay, Jehu, one of the commanders of the army, is coming at me like a madman. He's not sure why he's there. Maybe he's got an urgent message. And so he looks at him, he's coming at him, and somehow they had a dialogue while their chariots are moving towards each other. I don't know how that works, but they're driving towards each other. And Joram says, hey, Jehu, do you come in peace? And Jehu responds, somehow charging at him in the chariot, how can there be peace? I think somehow Jehu has a Batman voice. I don't know, but how can there be peace when there is idolatry and witchcraft caused by your mother Jezebel? And Joram gets the picture, and he turns his chariot around, and he screams at Ahaziah, treachery! And he runs away, and Jehu doesn't even slow down. He just goes and kills Joram and Ahaziah, dead. And they're like, wow, I kind of like that, right? I don't know about you. And then he makes a beeline for Jezebel's house, and he goes to the palace, and he rides up, and Jezebel sees him coming, and Jezebel at this point knows that Joram, her son, and Ahaziah are dead, and so what does she do? She goes to the old go-to move. She puts on her makeup, right? She goes and she sits on the window, and she's thinking, this has worked on other kings, it's going to work on Jehu. So she sits out on the window, and got her hair done, and she's all ready for him. He rides up, because she knows she might be in trouble, but she thought maybe she can seduce him. Well, apparently she doesn't have it anymore. Needs to get a weekend lift or something. Anyway, rides up. Jehu doesn't even speak to her. Jehu doesn't even give her the courtesy of talking. She just looks down and says, hey, Jehu, did you come in peace? And Jehu doesn't speak to her. He just yells up at the window, who's with me? And some servants stick their head out the window. These eunuchs stick their head out the window, and they're like, we're with you. Doesn't ever speak to Jezebel, and Jehu says, throw her down. And they push her on the ground, and she falls on the ground. I don't know what, I love this story, don't you? And then this happens, and so she's dead on the ground, and Jehu does what men do after they accomplish something like that. Jehu went in and ate and drank. Hey, you just killed 2 kings and a queen. What are you going to do? I'm going to eat a steak and have a beer. That's what I'm going to do. He went in, he ate, and he drank. And then he turned to the servants and said, take care of this cursed woman, he said, and bury her, for she was a king's daughter. But when they went out to bury her, they found nothing except her skull, her feet, and her hands. They went back out and told Jehu, who said, this is the word of the Lord. This is the word of the Lord that he spoke through his servant Elijah the Tishbite. And then he quotes Elijah, on the plot of ground at Jezreel, dogs will devour Jezebel's flesh. Jezebel's body will be like dung on the ground in the plot of Jezreel, so that no one will be able to say, this is Jezebel. Now you got to understand, this is all God's doing. Jehu is carrying out God's will. And it was God's will that Joram would die. It was God's will that Ahaziah would die. It was God's will, purpose, judgment, and intention that Jezebel would be like dung on the ground. And again, I don't know about you, but I kind of like that. And I think and I want to take a pause and just talk about that for just a second. Because that sounds kind of horrible and it sounds kind of violent, but I think we all have a sense of justice that is buried within us. I know when Saddam Hussein died, I know this is really weird. When he was hung, I found out that you could watch the video online. And it wasn't enough for me to just know that he had been hung. I wanted to see it. And so I actually got on YouTube, logged in, and watched Saddam. Terrible video. Couldn't hardly tell it was him. But you just watched the video of him died. And I shut it off. And it wasn't like I was like, I'm not weird. But I just shut it off and I went, that's good. That is right. That is good and that is right because I have a sense of justice inside of me, and it's the same sense of justice that God has inside of him. One more, maybe on a little lighter note. This may only connect with a few of you. You know when you're at Walmart and the kid starts crying for the toy, and mom says, no toy. And the kid falls down the ground and throws a fit and says, I hate you. And then mom gives the kid the toy to shut him up. And you're still thinking about that late at night, right? You're just like, I can't believe she gave him the toy. I can't believe she gave him the toy. She gave him the toy. The reason you do that is because you've got a sense of justice in you, and it's just, that ain't right, And that is born deep inside of us, and it's a good thing because that is God's justice. I just want to take a moment to say God's justice is good. God's anger, the anger of Jesus, is a good thing because without God's anger, there would be no justice. Right? There's a lot of people we see like Saddam Hussein or Hitler or whoever who actually get what's coming to them, and we see justice served. But there are so many people that never, at least in this lifetime, never get justice. There's people that run the sex trade where they keep women as slaves and they never pay for their crimes. But I promise you, God makes sure that they have justice. And I look at God's justice and I go, as scary as it is, as sometimes gory as it can be with Jezebel and Joram and Ahaziah, I look at that and I go, it is right. And it is good, and my only objective on this earth is to make sure that I am not on the receiving end of God's justice. And so instead of kind of not talking about God's anger, instead of kind of sidetracking it, we should look at it and we say, no, God's anger, God's justice is His goodness. It is His righteousness. After Jehu gets done with Jezebel and he goes out and I guess they bury her small casket in her skull and hands. After that happens, he then goes, and this is again completely in God's will, he goes and he realizes that the 70 sons of Ahab are held up in Samaria. And so he sits down while he's eating his steak and drinking his beer. He writes a letter. He sends this letter to the people that Ahab has left in charge of his sons. And he writes this letter and he says, hey, what you need to do is you need to appoint a king. You need to get your armies ready. You're in a fortified city, and get ready because I'm coming after you and you're all going to die. So pick one of the sons, appoint them as king, and let's do this. Love Jehu. Anyway, so these guys that Ahab left in charge of his kids then turn and write a letter back to Jehu because they are terrified of him. And they say to Jehu, hey, what about this? What about this? Just saying. What if we just handed over these sons of Ahab to you? How does that sound? And Jehu was like, All right, but I ain't no fool, right? I'm not falling for no trick. If you're really on my side, here's what I want you to do. I want you to cut off the heads of the 70 sons of Ahab. I want you to put them in a sack, and I want you to send them to me. And again, the people that Ahab left in charge to protect his kids grabbed all of his kids and cut their heads off and put them in a sack and took them to Jezreel. And this is what it says that Jehu did. 2 Kings 10. Then Jehu ordered, put them in 2 piles. He's talking about the heads. Put them in 2 piles at the entrance of the city gate, 35 here and 35 there. The next morning Jehu went out and he stood before all the people and he said, "You are innocent. It was I who conspired against my master and killed him, but who killed all of these? Know then that not a word the Lord has spoken against the house of Ahab will fail. The Lord has done what he announced through his servant Elijah." And again, just a quick reminder, everything that Jehu did, as bloody and gory and violent as it is, was God. And it was God's anger being poured out on the people that had led his people astray. And I want to make this point, that God's anger is actually his mercy. The reason that God killed these 70 sons, as bloody as that sounds, is because he knew that they were going to continue to corrupt his people, continue to lead them astray, continue to have guilt on their head, and that his people are just going to be farther and farther away from him. So he, in his anger, his very logical, very defined anger, destroyed the household of Ahab. And it is good, because God's anger is his mercy. And now for a really terrible story from my childhood. When I was 14, my dad asked me to go and kill some pigs. I know this might be a little too sensitive for some of you, but anyway, we had these pigs, and these are butcher-sized hogs. You know, they're pretty big hogs. But they would get this thing called rhinitis, and their noses would just kind of grow more and more like this to where they couldn't breathe. And so they would get to a point where finally, if you just kind of let this happen, they would eventually quit eating, and they would fall over, and they would just sort of struggle to breathe for weeks at a time until finally they would just die. And so Dad turned to me and he said, "Hey, we got to get those pigs out of there because they're going to infect the other pigs, and they're going to die this horrible, slow, painful death. And so what we've got to do is we've got to kill them." So I was 14. He was like, "Here's a 22. Go kill these pigs." Now, some of you might be out there going, "That's horrible. Isn't there like a place we could take these pigs and spend $2,000 for a surgery that would fix them?" Weird city people. Anyway, So what he asked me to do was he asked me to go kill him. Now, to us, that seems kind of violent and gory, but it was actually a good thing. And I want you to understand, I never, tortured pigs or anything. I didn't go out there with a 22. I'm like, right? Not doing that. I was going out to do a good thing, because when pigs die, guess what? There's no pig heaven, okay? They just cease to exist. Animals that die cease to exist. And so I was going out there, and I was like, I'm going to be doing a very good thing. So I go out there, and this is where the story kind of takes a dark turn, but I go out there with a 22 to shoot a butcher-sized hog, which my dad, I don't know if he really thought that through, so it's my dad's fault. So I go out there, and I aim at the pig's head, and I shoot him right in the head. And I thought, he's just going to... No! He acted like it didn't even faze him. He's got a bullet hole, and then he runs by me. I can't even do the pig scream. He runs by me, and you got to understand, again, I'm not having a good time. I'm really tore up about this, and I'm like, I don't know what to do. But I had a semi-automatic 22 Ruger, and when he ran by, I was just like, I don't know what to do. So I just sort of unloaded the clip in him as he ran by. because I wanted to do a good thing, right? Just long story short, an hour later and 4 boxes of 22 shells later, all 8 pigs were dead, and dragged them out. And it was bloody and it was ugly, but it was good. And God didn't want to kill the 70 sons of Ahab. God doesn't want to be angry with the people that he created. God doesn't want to bring his wrath down on mankind, but it is good that he does. God's anger and God's wrath is his mercy, Because with his judgment, others can escape. Others can come to know him. Others can understand. And so God administers his judgment and his anger and his wrath, which is very real and very plain because he is good. Jehu, on the other hand, Jehu kept going. So he kills Joram, and he kills Ahaziah, and he kills Jezebel, and then he goes and he kills the 70 sons. And at this point, Jehu's done. But then Jehu does something that we all do when we get angry. Jehu gets angry about the right thing, and he goes and he kills everybody that God wants him to kill, and then he goes too far. And then he doesn't know when to stop. Just Jehu's anger is a lot like that time where your dad, he got angry because you did something wrong, but he didn't react well. He didn't handle himself well, and he scarred you for life. Jehu's anger is kind of like that boss that one time where he was angry because numbers weren't up or your performance wasn't there. He was probably angry for a good reason, but he took it too far, and his anger wasn't good, and he made a fool out of himself. Jehu, that's what he does. See, at this point, Jehu's done, but in verse 11 it says, "So Jehu killed everyone in Jezreel who remained in the house of Ahab," which he was supposed to do, "as well as all of his chief men, his close friends, and his priests, leaving him no survivor." He just goes a little too, and he's kind of enjoying this, and he's the guy that likes to kind of slice people's heads off, and he's feeling pretty good, and so he's like, and while we're at it, let's do some more house cleaning, and he goes around and kills everybody. And 100 years later, the book of Hosea is written. And the prophet Hosea says this, that Jehu will finally pay for his bloodthirst at Jezreel. And God pronounces a judgment on God's people because Jehu's anger went too far. See, that's the kind of anger we're familiar with. That's what we understand. But here's what the beauty is, that Christ's anger, Jesus' anger, never goes too far. It isn't without reason. It's not like a madman in heaven. It is very purposeful, very intentional, and God does it for a specific reason. And here's what's beautiful about God's anger. When we get ready to celebrate Christmas, see, I don't know if you can really catch why we celebrate Christmas so thoroughly and so beautifully, because when Jesus came to the earth, God provided the only way for us to not be on the receiving end of his wrath. Jesus didn't come to protect us from the devil. Jesus didn't come to protect us from other people. Jesus came and died on a cross to protect us from God's justice. And because he loved us and cared for us so much, you and I are Jezebel. You and I are Joram and Ahaziah. You and I are those 8 pigs that needed to die. We are supposed to be on the receiving end of God's anger and his wrath, and his anger and his wrath is so very real, and it is so very good. But Jesus died on a cross and received the wrath of God in our place so that God's justice could be satisfied and God's grace could be administered. And you and I, if we believe in Jesus, if we give our life to him, if we say, hey, we're in, we want to be a part of that, you and I, and this is what's so beautiful about Christmas and Easter and coming to church every single week, you and I get off the hook. We don't have to be on the receiving end of God's wrath and God's anger. And so today, I just want to make that opportunity for you. We're having a baptism service, and that's not the reason. The reason we have this baptism service is so that we can understand God's grace, so we can receive that by faith and by belief in him, and that we can become these new people that God wants us to be. We go into the water and we come back up. That is a symbol of what God is doing in our life, that it's just as simple as our belief and as our faith in him. And if that doesn't give us a reason to celebrate, there's nothing that's going to give us a reason to celebrate. Let me pray.